program at the National Association of Realtors. And just a little kind of history of what we do. So NAR has over 1 million members who are all realtors around the country. The members started our Smart Growth program about 15 years ago to help realtors all around the country get involved in local land use planning projects. But one of the things we do at the national level is every couple of years we conduct a community preference poll. Sometimes it has a little more emphasis on housing preferences, other times on transportation. This year, we joined forces for the first time with Jennifer at Portland State University, and what this did for us was allowed us to get a much larger sample and some really insightful analysis. This poll, as well as our other ones, are available on our website. You can see the address on your screen, realtor.org, and just type in the search word community in the search bar, and that will drive you to it. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to Jennifer.
All right, I'm going to briefly talk about the methodology, just so you have some background on where all these data came from. So first of all, I think an important thing to keep in mind is that we sampled adults who are living in the 50 largest metropolitan areas in the U.S. So these are people who are living in urban areas. It may be the suburbs of those metro areas, but we do not have rural residents or small town residents unless it's a small town within a metro area. The survey was conducted in mid-May. We used two different samples in a sense, and partly because it's getting more and more difficult to do phone surveys. A lot of people don't answer the phone, and so we tried this approach. So we surveyed 1,000 people via a random phone survey. About 2/3 of those were landline, about 1/3 were wireless phone, again trying to make sure that our demographics match the population. And then we had a sample of 2,000 adults through the YouGov panel. And then we weighted those responses to adjust a little bit for things like age and income to make sure that we represented the population. We put those two samples together, so we have a total of 3,000 respondents. And again, just to emphasize, these are all people who are living in the 50 largest metro areas, which you can see there on the screen. This is a large share of the U.S. population. And to give you an idea of how representative this sample is of the population, it does match pretty close on many of the demographic characteristics such as income, gender, age, and education. There are some small differences, but we think that the sample does a pretty good job of representing the adults that live in those metro areas. Okay, so I am going to start out on the first set of findings, which is focusing on people's travel, how they get around every day in terms of focusing in particular on walking and biking for this presentation. So one of the things that we asked people was about just what do they like doing, because our research, my research and other people's research has definitely found that people's attitudes affect their decisions on whether or not they're going to walk or bike or drive and things like that. So we just asked some pretty simple statements. I like driving, I like walking, I like riding a bike, and asked people if they agreed or disagreed with that. And what we see here, what we've done on this is shown by the different generations. And overall, people do like walking. Most people, except for the oldest generation, liked walking more than the other modes. But what we notice in particular is that it's the millennial generation where there's the largest gap between liking walking and liking driving. And it's the millennials that like driving the least, though still, 70% of them agreed that they like driving. So the majority of them do like it, just that they like walking more so. the millennials also were more likely than the other generations to say that they like taking transit. So we asked some fairly broad questions about people's behavior in the past 30 days. And in particular, we asked in the past 30 days how often someone had gone for a walk outside for more than 10 minutes. And this would include all types of walking. So in this graph, we show a lot of the different demographics and different rates of walking for these different groups. There's a lot of information there. You'll get the slides afterwards if you want to dig into the numbers more. But a couple things I want to point out. First of all, at the bottom of the screen, where we have the different generations, we do see both millennials and Gen Xers are the two generations that are walking most frequently. We also see that men tend to walk a bit more frequently, as do people with kids in the household. We also see some differences in terms of income and education. One particularly interesting aspect of this, because obviously people walk for lots of different reasons. They walk for exercise, but they also walk to the store and things like that. And so we asked them, were any of those of the walks that you took in these past 30 days, and we asked what the purposes were. And you can see here that the millennials in particular are out there walking for transportation. They're walking to and from school or public transportation. They're walking to run errands and shopping. They are also walking for exercise, but more so than the other generations, they are walking for transportation. We also asked questions about barriers to walking and bicycling. And what we see here is that sort of the way we design our cities, the locations of people's destinations are not necessarily convenient. So a large majority of all of these adults felt that the places that they need to go to are too far away to walk. That's a bit less so for the millennials, which indicates, and you'll see data later on, that they're living in different types of environments. So neighborhood design is really important for getting people to walk more, particularly for transportation. Secondly, followed, needing a vehicle for other reasons was a barrier for a lot. Weather, turns out, obviously, that's a seasonal thing. And then you can see some other differences. These aren't major barriers for most people, but particularly, for example, the oldest generation, their health is a barrier to walking more. And sorry about that. For some people, fear of crime is also a barrier for walking. We asked basically the same set of questions about bicycling in the past 30 days. And what I'm showing here, the red parts of the bar indicates the share of the people who rode a bike in the past 30 days, and at least some of those trips were for transportation, such as going to work or shopping, things like that. The blue bars are people who also biked in the past 30 days, but the only trip purpose was for exercise, recreation, just going out for a bike ride. And so you can see 25% of our respondents had biked in the past 30 days. One thing that I need to clarify here is these numbers are only of the adults who said that they were physically able to ride a bike and knew how to ride a bike. So that was a screening question, and actually 72% of our respondents said that they were physically able and knew how to ride a bike. And so of those, overall 25% had ridden at least once in the past 30 days, but you can see from the overall bar at the bottom of that that most people are biking only for recreation and exercise, not to get to work or shopping, things like that. But we definitely see some differences in different demographic categories with respect to whether or not people are biking and why are they biking. And in particular, you see the millennials are the generation that's biking the most for transportation. The Gen X generation is biking the most overall, and that difference, though, between them and the millennials is really that they're biking more for exercise and recreation. We see a definite large gender split in terms of bicycling, and this is something that we've seen in lots of different data sets. Men are far more likely to have ridden a bike than women in the past 30 days, and both for transportation and exercise. Also of note, people with kids in the household are more likely to ride a bike, and that's primarily because they're out there riding for exercise and recreation. We didn't specifically ask if they're biking with their kids, but I think you have to assume that a lot of that is biking with their kids. You also see some differences both geographically. For example, in LA region, there's more going on than in some other parts of the country. Also by race and ethnicity, and some differences by income. And you see by income, really the differences have to do a lot by whether people are biking for recreation, such as in the upper income category, or if they're biking for transportation, which is in the lower income category. We asked a similar set of questions as to whether, what keeps people from biking more. And these findings are similar to the barriers for walking. And again, places being too far away to bike wasn't quite as big of a barrier as it is for walking, which makes sense because usually people bike a lot farther than they're willing to walk. But still, for about half of these residents, having places too far away was a barrier to biking. Also, somewhat surprising, almost half of our respondents also said that they do not have a bike to ride as a barrier. And then that's followed by sort of safety issues related to traffic, and related to that is also not having enough bike lanes and trails. Looking into those barriers just a little more in terms of demographics, this is the barrier of places are too far. And basically, for just about everyone, this is a major barrier. You can see the only place where it's really largely different is in New York City, where things are much more dense and destinations closer together. So this is a barrier across the board. In somewhat of a contrast, that barrier of not having a bike to ride, we see some more differences. And in particular, you see some differences with respect to income. Lower income households are more likely to not have a bike to ride. We see women are more likely to say that they don't have a bike to ride, and also people without the kids in the household. And then you see some barriers in terms of generations and age as well. Now, obviously, whether or not someone has a bike is also related to how much they want to ride a bike, how much they like biking, and so these things are obviously related to each other. A couple of the other barriers I want to point out before we move on. On the left there is the share of people who said that having too few bike lanes or trails is a barrier. Overall, it's a barrier for 38%, but we definitely see some differences. For example, it's a bigger barrier for women than men. And then on the right was people who thought that not feeling safe because of traffic is a barrier. And in general, a lot of these numbers are a bit higher than not having enough bike lanes and trails nearby. And you see a few differences. For example, for women, that's even a bigger barrier, is not feeling safe because of traffic. And I think the differences between these two things, they're obviously related, but the differences have to do with the fact that, whenever you ride a bike, there's a good chance you're going to have to ride in places that don't have bike lanes or trails. You're going to have to ride on regular streets with traffic. So that gives you a snapshot of sort of current behavior and barriers with respect to walking and biking. We had another section of the survey talking about policy priorities, and these are questions, similar questions have been asked on previous surveys that have been done by the National Association of Realtors. And obviously with the reauthorization of the transportation bill, these topics are of great interest. So we asked a broad question about just sort of priorities for the government, in transportation priorities for the government. And by far, maintenance was the clearest priority for everyone. 83% of the people who had an opinion said that maintaining roads, bridges, highways was a priority, either extremely high priority or high priority. And that's far exceeded the next priorities, such as building more roads, expanding roads to reduce traffic congestion, expanding transit, and some of the other options. What's particularly interesting are some of the generational differences, and this links back to people's travel behavior and how they use our transportation system. So for example, you see there that the millennials in most cases are placing a higher priority on things like public transit and providing alternatives to driving, developing communities where people do not have to drive long distances. Those are a bit higher priority for the millennials compared to the older generations, particularly the baby boomers and the oldest generation. And then conversely, you can see that maintenance isn't quite as high a priority. But again, 75 or 74% or more of each generation put that as a high priority. We also asked people, given the shortage of funding to do maintenance and expand all those other options, we asked people what they were willing to do to help raise revenue. And the way the question was worded, I think, is important. So it says, as you may know, increased fuel efficiency in cars has resulted in less gas tax funding to support roads and transit. Thinking about this, which one of the following approaches would you take to replace that tax revenue? And as you can see, a large share, a quarter of our respondents either did not know or did not want to provide an answer. So a lot of indecision out there. And then another large group, 28%, just said, well, I don't want to replace the tax revenue. On a more, if you want to take a more glass half full approach to things, you can look at the other three bars there on the left. So 17% were willing to replace the gas tax with a tax based on the number of miles driven. So what's often referred to as a VMT, or vehicle mileage traveled fee. And then an equal share was willing to increase the gas tax. These numbers actually were not far off from previous, the survey that the National Association did a couple years ago. And then 11% were willing to increase tolls or build more toll roads. So what is perhaps surprising is somewhat equal interest to going towards a VMT fee equal to a gas tax increase. Those two things combined, you could say, over a third are willing to sort of raise revenue somehow through gas tax or VMT fee. I am now going to turn it over to Hugh to talk about the section of the survey that dug into people's housing preferences.
Great. Thank you, Jennifer. Can everybody hear me all right? So now we're going to look at some findings on housing preferences, and basically where we explore what transportation features are important in deciding where to live and whether or not people prefer walkable neighborhoods. So let's see if I have control. Here we go, first slide. Okay, so first off, we asked folks what transportation options are important when they're deciding where to live, and here are the results in rank order. The column all the way to the right are folks who indicated that that option was very important, and the column in the middle there has aggregated the very important or somewhat important. So sidewalks and places to take walks top the list, and followed by highways, and then being within easy walk of other places in the community, and a short commute to work, and transit, and then bike lanes and paths. Now this was a question that we had asked, at least some of these items, in previous polls. So here on the right, you can see that in 2011, NAR's national poll asked some of these same questions. And curiously, the top three items, so sidewalks, easy access to the highway, and being within an easy walk of other places, came out with the same rank order, but this time around in 2015, all of them received higher responses. So we're not really sure what is going on there. We're going to dig into the data more to see if we can explain that in the future. Let's see. Next slide. All right, it's not advancing. There we go. We did see some preferences in terms of what transportation options people are looking for, broken out by generation. And so the red bar represents the millennials here. And millennials are more interested in being within easy walking distance of places and having public transportation. So those are where they really kind of stand out above the other generations. Let's see. There we go. Thank you. So one thing that was interesting is that women seem to prefer value walking more than men do. 61% of women indicated that it was very important to have sidewalks and places to take walks when deciding where to live. Now, this contrasts with what Jennifer showed you a few slides back, which is that men are actually doing more walking than women. So we might be able to dig into that a little later. Also, 46% of women said it was very important to be within easy walking distance of places in the community versus 37% for men. And finally, 40% of women said having public transit nearby was important to them versus 33% for men. So that's a little bit of a gender difference there. Okay, next slide. There we are. We then moved on and asked two questions having to do with housing preference type and the associated transportation options or options associated with those housing types. In aggregate, the Americans seem to be roughly split on the preference between walkable mixed-use communities and the more conventional suburban driving community. So given the choice between Community A over on the left with the blue pie slice, those were folks, 45% of people chose the option that had a house with a large yard and you had to drive to places you wanted to go, versus 48%, which we call the walkable community, which are houses with smaller yards and it's easy to walk to places that you needed to go. So a slight preference for the walkable community, but really within the margin of error there. All right. So when you dice that up by generation, this is what you get. And what we're seeing is that the walkable community shows a stronger preference for baby boomers, 51%, and the millennials. They tend to drift towards community B, whereas the Gen Xers are a little more sliding towards the conventional suburb situation. All right, next. So we then asked the kind of a housing question in a slightly different way. Here we talked about the kind of the type of home and also threw in wording about the commute. So over on the left side, the blue, this time is owning or renting an apartment or townhouse, so an attached home, and you have an easy walk to shops and restaurants and have a shorter commute, 45%. On the right side, in orange, you own or rent a detached single-family house, and you have to drive to shops or restaurants and have a longer commute, so 48%. So when you throw in the type of structure and the commute options, the results switched a little bit, skewing slightly towards the detached, more conventional house. But what's interesting, this is a question we actually asked back in 2011, and in that year, the blue folks, so the attached walkable community, received a score of 38%, now 45%, so that trended up. The detached conventional house received a score in 2011 of 59%, and now 48%, so that trended down. So they're really kind of meeting in the middle here over the last 4 or 5 years. All right, next slide. Pops up. There we go. All right, so when you dice that up by generation, the millennials are skewed towards the attached walkable community, where they're willing to sort of have what might be a smaller dwelling, an apartment or a townhouse, and but the trade-off is that you're able to walk to more things and have a shorter commute. So then, lastly for me on this housing, thank you. So one of the questions that I hear floating around out there is, what are the millennials going to do when they have kids and the kids get to be school age? Will they kind of maybe abandon their inner city urban living and head off to the suburbs? So this is as close as we can get to answering that question. Here we have taken folks who prefer the attached dwelling and walkable community. So that was our base here, and then broke it up by generation. And for each generation showed the portion or a bar that for kids in the household versus no kids. Now we don't know how old those kids are, but for the millennials with kids in the household, there was no significant difference in the share that chose the attached home in a walkable location, and over half chose that option. For Gen Xers with kids, there is a difference. Only 40% of the Gen Xers with kids preferred the attached walkable option compared to 49% of Gen Xers without kids. And the difference for the baby boomers really showed no statistically significant difference. So that's where we can come down on that question. And with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jennifer.
Thank you, Hugh. So Hugh just presented some of the findings with, when we asked people if you're going to choose now where to live, where would you choose? What's important to you? We also asked some questions about where they currently live in terms of the type of home and different characteristics of their neighborhood. And then what I'm going to do is present those results and relate the two together some. So first of all, even though these are metro areas, remember these are largely, a lot of these metro areas have large suburbs, and so 60% of all of our respondents do live in a detached single-family house. And so that's the majority of the people that we were talking with live in that environment, whether it's walkable or not, but they're living in a detached single-family house. You can see some differences you would expect. Places like New York City, that number is a lot lower. There's differences by income, etc. But one of the things that we did is tried to link sort of where are people currently living with how did they respond to those questions about a choice. Given a choice today, which of A or B would they choose? And trying to get at the question, are people currently living in what they would choose to live in? And we can see that actually there's a decent share of the population that I would say is perhaps not exactly matched. So this is a pretty simple cut. So what we see on that first line are people who currently live in a detached single-family home, but they chose that option when we presented it to them to choose the apartment or townhouse in the walkable neighborhood. And so overall, of the people who answered all of these questions, 25% currently live in a detached home, but given the choice, chose the attached home in the walkable neighborhood. Then, of course, we have some people who want the opposite switch. So 13% of our respondents currently live in an attached home, apartment, condo, whatever, but they would prefer living in the detached home with a conventional, sort of the more conventional neighborhood. And then at the bottom, we have the folks who are a bit more matched. I do want to emphasize that in terms of people's current housing situation, this is only showing whether they lived in detached or attached, not how walkable their current neighborhood might be. But what it does indicate is that there, a fairly large share of the population wants a more walkable mixed-use community, is currently perhaps not living in that type of a neighborhood. When we dig into that a little bit more, and this was perhaps a little surprising, it is the respondents in our highest income category, 100,000 and above, where 31% of them fit into that group, that they currently live in a detached single-family home, but they chose the attached walkable neighborhood when given that choice between A and B. And so whereas you see at the lower income category, you still have some mismatch, but there's also more people in that category who would like to move from the attached home to the detached home. So we also asked people about their current neighborhood, and you can see here, and some of these things match up to those the housing preference questions. So you can see here that, for example, only 34% of our respondents strongly agreed that there are lots of places to walk to nearby their current home, such as shops, cafes, and restaurants. Another 27% somewhat agreed with that statement. But I would sort of argue that to really focus on the strongly agree, that perhaps only 34% of our sample is really living in a really walkable community. On the other hand, they do have sidewalks, so 52% strongly agreed that there are sidewalks on most of the streets in their neighborhood, which is a good sign. On the other end of the scale, only a third strongly agreed that there are bike lanes and paths nearby. if we look at the answers to that by some of the generational, and this gives us a sense of where are people choosing to live, and not surprising given some of the earlier findings from the study, those millennials are living in places where, at least they say, there are lots of places to walk nearby, more so than the other generations. They were also a little more likely to say that there was public transit nearby, but less likely to say that there are lots of bike lanes and paths nearby. And then finally, we started out, actually, the survey started out with a pretty broad question, which was, would you say that you were very satisfied, somewhat dissatisfied, or very dissatisfied with the quality of life in your community? Very broad statement. And you can see over 80% of our respondents are satisfied, about equally split between very and somewhat. Of course, it's interesting to try to figure out, well, what makes people satisfied with their community. Lots of things that can go into that, but one of the things that we have looked at is that walkability aspect of it. So on the right-hand side now, you can see each of those bars are the groups of people in terms of how they responded to the question about where they currently live. So the first bar on the left are the people who strongly agreed that there are lots of places to walk nearby, such as shops, cafes, and restaurants where they currently live. And so of those people that strongly agreed that there's lots of places to walk to, 54% were very satisfied with the quality of life in their community, which you can see is significantly higher than the other people who either only somewhat agreed or disagreed that there were places to walk nearby. And so this gives us some indication that having places to walk nearby may be affecting people's quality of life in their community. Now, obviously, there's lots of things that affect people's quality of life in their community, and we're going to dig into these data a bit more. I've started in on that analysis using some regression analysis, trying to predict, what influences people's satisfaction with their community. And these results, the sort of having places to walk nearby, even when I start controlling for things like income and the type of house people live in, and their age and some of those other factors, this is still a significant predictor of the satisfaction in their community. I'm going to be doing more analysis, but I think that is a positive finding, that having places to walk nearby likely improves people's sense of their community and the quality of life in their community. On that note, we're going to open it up for questions. What I will start us out with is that the survey was just conducted in May. We have just done what I would call the first cut of the analysis. These are the big picture findings. We're going to be digging into the data a lot more, including, as Hal mentioned, we have a webinar next week that's going to focus on some of the bicycling questions on the survey. And like I just alluded to, I'm going to be digging into the quality of life questions quite a bit more. I'll also acknowledge again that this was supported by the National Association of Realtors and Portland State University through our funding from the U.S. Department of Transportation. So with that, I think Hal may have questions to field. Type them into the box.
Great. Yes, great. Thanks, Jennifer, and thanks, Hugh, for your very, very informative presentation. So for those viewing the webinar, please feel free to continue submitting your questions if you have them. We do have a few questions that were submitted by the audience. So I'll just ask them of you in the order they were inputted into the questions panel. So the first one is, did you look at people want transportation options in terms of generations as well?
So I think, well, yes, we did. If I'm interpreting the question correctly, I think the question may have come in just before we presented that slide. So we did, and I think Hugh, I think it's this slide in terms of the preferences by generation.
Okay.
We also, I don't have a slide on it, but obviously we have the data looking at, well, we showed the data in terms of gender too, and obviously we can look at it for other things as well.
Okay, great. And I think you answered this just briefly, but is it really surprising that being within a short commute to work is not a priority to the silent generation?
Yeah. Yeah, and one thing that we could do, we do have data on whether these people work outside the home, and so we could limit the analysis to people who work outside the home and then see, because some of those oldest generations still are working, so we could limit it to that way and see if there really is, if there still is a difference.
Okay, great. And then the next question is, there is public transportation nearby represented at a higher level by millennials than the other generations. Could this also be a reflection of level of awareness?
Yeah, I mean, that is, I mean, to me, that applies to all of this. That's always a limitation when you ask people, like, are there bike lanes nearby? People who bike may pay more attention to if there are bike lanes nearby, or they have a different sense of yes or no to that question. If there are not enough bike lanes, they may be less likely to agree with that. So there are two things going on here. There's the objective, really, is there public transit, and then are they noticing it, or how do they interpret the word nearby? So, so that's important to keep in mind. I think two things that we will do. We do have the zip codes of where these people live, and so we are going to try to link these data up to some what we would call objective measures of transit availability or bike lanes and things like that, density, to the extent that we can get those data to see how those might match up. I think the other thing to keep in mind, if part of what we're looking at is the potential for people who might use transit or walk or bike instead of driving, their perception is very important. If they don't think there's transit nearby, they're probably not going to think about using it, whether it exists or not. So those perceptions are important, but yes, the person who asked the question is definitely correct,
Okay.
that you have to think about that.
Okay, so this next question refers back to slide number 24, and the question is, have you asked this question in prior surveys? And if so, have the results changed over time?
So Hugh, you have that.
I do, and I'd be happy to get in contact with that person who asked that question. I need to dig into our previous year surveys, and I think we asked it in maybe a slightly different way that made me not want to put a comparison up there.
Okay.
But happy to review that.
Okay, so Hugh, I just sent you the name of the person who asked that question.
Great, thanks.
And I'll add one thing also. Keep in mind that this year the survey was only of people living in the largest metropolitan areas. And I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, Hugh, that in the past the survey was a much broader representation of the population. So it would have included people living in more rural or small urban areas. And that can also affect sort of the comparisons.
Yep. And then were the transportation questions, were those new this year, or were they asked in previous years as well?
Most of those were new,
okay.
Yeah, so we don't have comparisons on the sort of whether or not people like biking or how much they did in the past 30 days. Those were all new.
Okay. All right, a few more questions. Are there any data to explain why so few of the folk living currently in attached structures do not prefer switching to detached? I don't know if you were able to dig into that in the survey.
So could you repeat that again?
Sure. Are there any data to explain why so few folk living currently in attached structures do not prefer switching to detached?
To detached. Oh, I have not dug into that yet. So that would be the people, let's see, sorry, I need to, so we have 24% of the people who currently live in an attached home who chose to, when we gave them the option to live in the apartment townhouse walkable. My hunch is, a lot of those are the millennials who enjoy living in that type of neighborhood, and that is something that we could dig into, is sort of the preferences, what's important. So I would have to assume that those people, the walkability is much more important to them than having the yard and things like that.
Okay, great. A few more are coming in as you guys are answering questions, so that's great to see. So we do have a question that relates to the 2011 survey. So are there any data from the 2011 NAR survey that can compare the change in housing preferences of millennials?
We do have...
And Hugh, you may need to speak up. You're a
yep.
little quiet on your end.
Sure. How's that? A little better?
That's better. That's better.
Okay. We do have housing, some housing preference situation questions in the 2011 survey, and I would need to kind of pull out the data set to do some crosstabs with the generations.
Okay.
So I don't
Great.
have a quick answer, but it can be had.
Okay. Okay. And I'll give you the name of the person who asked that question, so you could perhaps follow up with her.
Okay.
Okay, and then we have two more questions, and I think these are for Jennifer. The first one is, did the survey ask why these preferences existed? For example, why do millennials tend to value transit and walkable communities? Does it have to do with whether they themselves grew up in the suburbs and want something different?
Yeah, unfortunately, we don't have a whole lot. I mean, that's a big limitation of doing, in particular, doing phone surveys. So there's a limit to how long people will be on the phone with you. So we don't. Now, there are a few questions on the survey that can help us figure out, like we do have on the questions related to transit, we ask people, are they taking transit because they don't have any other option? So we get at that a little bit, but no, this piece of research isn't digging deep into some of those motivations, unfortunately, the limitations.
And I would say most generations before grew up in, walking to school in the suburbs. So that would be an interesting research question to dig into.
Right.
Yes.
So for folks who did not want to replace taxes for road maintenance, did they suggest how to pay for it?
No, they did not. Well, we did not give them an opportunity. Yeah, it's a little frustrating given how important it is to raise some revenue to fix our transportation system. And so no, in this survey we didn't dig into that. The Mineta Transportation Institute, based at San Jose State University, has done more in-depth surveys on people's sort of funding preferences, and so that might be worth looking at their most recent work to dig into.
Okay, great. So I think we have time for 3 more questions, and I see the 3 questions in the questions pane. The first one is directed at Hugh, and it says, there is a current commercial from the NAR that shows a family that is looking at an urban attached home. Then the commercial then shows how the realtor redirects them to a suburban home because it has a good school. So this person is curious as to why the NAR would be running ads suggesting that urban housing does not have good schools, especially in light of the desires shown in the survey. So I don't know if that's something that you can respond to, Hugh.
That is a good question, and I have not seen that commercial, but I'll track that down and talk to the folks who made it and see what their thinking was.
Okay.
Our general position in terms of housing is that, even though there are these various preferences, there's room for a whole range of housing types in the country, and at any given point in time, there will be people who want each housing type.
Okay, great, thanks. And then this goes back to the detached homes discussion. So for people who live in detached homes but prefer attached homes, how much of this mismatch can be attributed to the lack of existing attached home options in their income ranges in their area? So I don't know if Hugh or Jennifer can speak to that.
I'll start. I mean, I can't answer that question directly with our data. I would have to sort of point to maybe other research that people are doing. And there is other research out there that also shows this kind of mismatch, and that at least historically that sort of attached, particularly higher quality or nice attached walkable neighborhood housing is not necessarily being built at the rate that people may now be demanding it. Sometimes our home building practices may be a little slow to catch up with some of these shifts in demand. But we can't say with these data how much of it is because they can't find it. They don't have that option available to them, either at the price they want or their location, or if there's other reasons that they haven't made that shift.
Hugh, did you want to respond to that at all?
Yeah, it's a good question, and I was talking to some folks at the National Association of Home Builders yesterday, just trying to get a handle on a good description breakdown of the nation's housing stock by type and so forth, to try and get a handle on that.
Okay.
And so I don't have an answer, but I hope to at some point.
Sure, and then this is sort of related to that too, so I'll ask this to both Jennifer and Hugh. So the baby boomers and millennials have desires for a walkable community, while Gen X prefers conventional suburbs. Are there data as to why they prefer these options, and any other data you've noticed that these two groups find similar wants?
Well, when we look at the data, for example, about their travel preferences, we also see that those two generations, they like walking. With the baby boomers, there's definitely a share of those folks that are maybe in the market to downsize because their families are changing. But unfortunately, with our survey data, there's sort of a limit to how far we can go in terms of explaining all of the underlying reasons between these preferences.
And Hugh, have you done any delving into that of the data to see the differences? Okay.
No, haven't yet.
Okay, great. And then we have one last question, and I believe it may have been mentioned early on, and it's worth repeating, but what was the sample size and margin error of the survey?
Yeah, so overall, we had a sample of 3,000, and the margin of error was just under 3%.
Okay, great. And I think that's it for our questions. I just want to thank Jennifer and Hugh again for sharing the results of your work. It's been very informative and exciting to be able to present new findings from a brand new survey. results. And so we are looking for your feedback so that we can continue to offer relevant webinars in the future. So we will be sending out a short email survey, and we hope that you'll respond to that to give us your feedback on the webinar as well as ideas for future webinars that we can put on for you. You can also view our other professional development offerings on our website at nitse.us, and this concludes our webinar. Thank you and enjoy the rest of your day.